Good evening. My name is Damon Cates, and I'm the Senior Associate Vice President of Alumni Relations and Development, and I'm also the Campaign Director at the University of Chicago, and I'm also a proud 2005 graduate of the Booth School of Business. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Wearing my campaign hat, just for a couple of minutes, I wanted to talk with you about some of the things that we have going on campus that is very characteristic of what we might consider the University of Chicago to be, which is unique. So what's unique about our campaign? The first is that it's one of the 5th largest ever announced in higher education history. Other universities have raised more than what our goal is, which is $4.5 billion. But to launch out of the gate a campaign of that size puts us in an elite group and a very aspirational group. But in addition to that, the thing that is also very unique about our campaign is that at the exact same time that we launched such a comprehensive, large, aspirational goal, we also wanted to make sure that we launched an engagement and a participation goal as well. So publicly, we said that we not only want to raise $4.5 billion, but we also want to engage 125,000 or more of our alumni. No other university has publicly launched a campaign with both of those goals, being focused on the participation and the dollar amount. And I think that says a lot about who we are at the University of Chicago. So under that umbrella, under the engagement and participation piece, I'd like to encourage you, if you can, to please invest financially into the university. If you've already made a gift, that's terrific. Thank you very much. If you haven't made a gift, please do. If you have made a gift, it's okay to make another one. And also, if you have an opportunity to create and fund internship opportunities for any of our students, they're much needed, and they're a terrific way for us to be able to connect our alumni and our students and to provide really great professional training for any of our students. If you have some extra time and could volunteer in the regional clubs or with our affinity groups or other volunteer opportunities for your reunion, whatever it may be, please do that. If you have the chance to hire any of our graduates from the University of Chicago, the network is alive and well, and please think of the University of Chicago first. And then, if you also have the opportunity to connect with us and to stay connected with us, whether it's attending this evening's events like tonight's event, or connecting with us virtually, or just continuing your lifelong quest for knowledge and connection to the university, we please hope that you will do that as well. So I'm very excited about tonight's program. You'll be hearing more from additional speakers, but I'm excited about tonight's program because this too is the first time that I've had a chance to hear personally from John about his new book and the history of the university, which we're celebrating our 125th anniversary this year. So thank you again for joining us this evening.
The University of Chicago is urban, global, courageous,
unusual,
phenomenal,
rigorous,
fabulous,
outspoken,
economics and pizza,
pushing borders,
invigorating,
an intellectual crucible
that pushes you to be your best every day.
From its inception, the University of Chicago focused on rigorous, intense inquiry. It's defined everything about what the University of Chicago is today and what it will be in the future.
The core curriculum is the symbol of who we are. Our mission is to get very talented students and to put them through a program of systematic, interdisciplinary training, and 4 years later, graduate Chicago intellectuals.
I'll bring up a discovery that we've made, then I'll proceed to criticize my own discovery. It's through self-criticism you create a learning culture of critical inquiry.
We aren't just talking at each other, we're listening. And at the end of the class, I may have a completely different perspective on the issue.
Some excellent students over the years. They were very much my teachers. It changed my work. It just exposed me to a world of ideas.
I was the beneficiary of a scholarship from the University of Chicago. I could not have gone to business school without that scholarship.
I just feel so grateful that I was selected to kind of be among the minds and the intelligence and the incredible people. It's been the best experience of my life.
I think supporting young people to pursue their dreams opens up the world to you. All we ask of anybody is that they do the same to the next generation.
The university is really made by the people in it.
Really very competitive.
Very unruly.
Seeing all the crazy, amazing things that they're doing.
Curing diabetes, cancer.
Innovation, more entrepreneurship, new ventures, new technologies.
Really forces me to push for something beyond what I'm doing.
In higher education today, the humanities are really in retreat. We really think that it's a responsibility to continue to foster growth of the humanities. The Collegium will allow teams of humanists from all over the world to tackle problems that society needs to deal with.
The Institute of Molecular Engineering is organized around solving water, energy, health problems through designing matter from molecules up. Just solving one of all of these problems that we're working on would be tremendous.
You're part of an intellectual community
that attracts individuals who are intellectually fearless.
That will bring together experts from different disciplines to help solve problems.
We're exploring opportunities to create more portals for the community and people in the city to come into the university and both get some of the knowledge that we have, but also share their knowledge with us.
Lots of people are skeptical about the ability to use social programs to prevent crime. What we've tried to do is to generate evidence that is so rigorous and so compelling that the most skeptical skeptic will have to acknowledge that there's really something here. 1 year of participation in the Youth Guidance and Becoming a Man program reduced violent crime arrests to these kids by over 40%, which I think really challenges the conventional wisdom that the only way that you can control crime and violence in the United States is through locking up millions and millions of people.
And if you show the impact, it has global reach. Billions of people, not just millions, billions of people that you can get to.
It's very important in a world which is becoming more integrated that you have these global universities.
We now have a rather more ambitious global strategy with the same gold standard quality of curriculum and teaching.
Students are going to want an experience of understanding other cultures because this is going to be the world that they are functioning in over the coming decades.
Can we bring people, scholars, politicians, administrators from these different areas also together to discuss what's going on?
To debate the big challenges facing the world.
Human illness limits society, and accordingly, fixing that, addressing it, is hugely important. It's transformative.
I had been diagnosed with metastatic or advanced breast cancer. The first thing Dr. Fumi Olopati said to me is, I want to find out more about your tumor so that I can personalize the treatment for both you and the tumor. The survival rate for metastatic diseases was 1 to 2 years. I really must say that I have survived the odds. I mean, I'm still sitting here, standing here 10 years plus.
You know what? It's worth every day getting up and supporting patients like her.
We have an enormous obligation to the people who gave us the opportunity today to do what we do with these young people, and in turn, they have an obligation to support those who come after us.
The question for us today is, how do we realize these values in a powerful way going forward?
Together, we are spreading grace and humanity.
Together we are
thinking about ways in which you could have an impact on society.
Together, we have the potential to change the way people think about urban problems.
Together,
we make amazing discoveries possible.
It's part of our DNA. It's who we are.
It's a big, big universe here.
Ours is the university of great discoveries.
Ours is the university of fearless inquiry.
Ours is the university that develops ideas that change the world.
Fearless inquiry, that was spectacular. Good evening, my name is Robin Hammer, and tonight, my husband Jay Hammer joins me in welcoming you all here. Jay and I entered the college over 40 years ago and have been proud alumni, and in 2010, our son Benjamin entered the college, and we were proud to say graduated from the college in the spring of 2014 with a degree in biology. Tonight, as a family, we are honored to introduce Dean Boyer, Dean of the college. We have enjoyed watching the college grow, and more recently, through the student experience of our son Ben, Jay and I have watched the college flourish, building on what has always made it great. The core curriculum continues to challenge students with essential questions and original texts. Top faculty continue to teach in the college, advancing and creating fields of study with the help of undergraduate students. And now, more than ever, the college is building on this tradition of academic rigor and excellence. Jay and I smiled at each other when we saw the Fagel's Iliad. We're in book groups ourselves now. They didn't have the Fagel's Iliad when we went. We had a different translation, so we're rereading the Iliad and the Odyssey with the new translation. When students arrive at the college, they will find a school that is more diverse than ever and more accessible than ever, meeting the full demonstrated financial need of its students through scholarships, grants, and assistance. Once enrolled at the college, students find enriching opportunities beyond the classroom. They can participate in over 300 registered student organizations. They can study abroad at university centers. We saw in Paris, Beijing, Delhi, or Hong Kong, and in program sites worldwide. And they can pursue funded internship opportunities. The college offered 1,300 Metcalf internships last year. Upon graduation, in part because of the strength of the careers program offered, over 95% of college students embark on full-time jobs, graduate programs, and service in just 10 months after graduation. It's pretty great also. We have proudly watched our son and his friends, many of whom are here tonight, enter exciting fields both in work and in graduate school. Ben did research in Boston his first year out at Harvard Medical School and the School of Public Health, and we're happy to say that he is now back in DC and working as a healthcare consultant at a large DC-based consulting firm. Some of his friends have entered the world of finance, literature, gaming, and as has always been true, the life of the mind. Many are in graduate school or even professional school, pursuing advanced degrees and furthering their knowledge after an exhilarating start in Chicago. We know these results would not be possible without John Boyer. Since he began as dean in 1992, Dean Boyer has improved the student experience at the college considerably, at the same time preserving the intellectual rigor the college is known for. As a historian, as a leader, as a Maroon, John Boyer deserves our respect and gratitude. And as a bicyclist, John Boyer deserves our admiration. As many of us know, his preferred mode of transportation is a bicycle, which he rides even in the worst Chicago winters. His route from meeting to meeting takes him past the new Granville-Grossman Commons, Logan Center, the new multidisciplinary Center for Arts on campus, serving students, faculty, and the Southside community. He pedals past the construction site for the new Campus North Residential Commons, a naming opportunity, folks, which will accommodate 800 students as part of his goal to house more students closer to campus. He pedals past the Institute of Politics, led by David Axelrod, which elevates the university's status as a hub for political inquiry. And total aside, the other day I was following through a link on Facebook from Chicago and wound up listening to David Axelrod and Bernie Sanders in the back of the van coming back from the airport. It's easy. You can go on iTunes, and it's really fun to listen to what's going on there. So even though we're not there, we can hear what everybody is doing in Chicago. And he weaves skillfully, I'm sure, around college students who are enriched academically and socially by these buildings and the priorities they represent. John W. Boyer, the Martin I. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor of History, became Dean of the college in 1992 and was reappointed to a 5th term in 2012. Boyer has served as an editor of the Journal of Modern History since 1980. In 1992 and 93, he was acting dean of the Division of Social Sciences. He was also chair of the Council on Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences from 1986 to 2009. He regularly teaches European civilization in the college, as well as courses in modern European history, the Habsburg Empire, and modern Germany. While John Boyer has written the history of the University of Chicago, it is his strong and skillful leadership that makes us confident in its future. Please help me welcome Dean John Boyer.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I'm delighted that so many of you come out to see the text that I'm having a hard time reading. I thought I would, could they get us a little bit of light up here? Is it possible? Yeah. David, where's David? Thank you so much. It would have been a very short talk. I want to talk a little bit this evening about how I came to write this book. The book is a very complicated book. It's a big book about a big and complicated university, and it's also a book that is a scholar's book, for better or worse. It's not a book that is meant to simply make us feel great about everything involving the history of the university, because that's not the history of the university. It's really a history of aspiration and achievement, but also conflict and failure. It's a book about people being very pleased with what the university did at certain times and being very disappointed and indeed angry about things that the university did or did not do. And so it's a complicated book, and the best thing I can do is to ask you to read it. If you can't afford it, I'm sure the libraries will have copies. And then you can either say, tell me you liked it, or tell me you didn't like it, and that's fine too, in good University of Chicago fashion. But tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about how I came to write the book, and a little bit about what I learned in that process. So many years ago, I remember Leonard Krieger, who was a distinguished intellectual historian of modern Germany, was one of my teachers in the 1960s, describing his experiences as a young OSS researcher during World War II. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor and the early and massive German and Japanese victories in the Pacific and on the Eastern Front in 1941 and 1942, the staff of the Research and Analysis branch of the OSS, these were young scholars who were just recruited to help the government. They were in great despair about what was going to happen. I mean, if you think about the situation in late 1941 and 42, it was pretty dismal. And these young people went to William Langer, who was a senior historian, who was the leader of their group. He was a professor from Harvard, but he'd been seconded down to Washington. And he was a senior historian of European diplomatic history. And they kind of went up to him and they said, you know, like, give us some hope. Tell us what's going to happen. Tell us that it's not that bad. And Langer's response, given in a very cautionary tone, according to my friend Leonard Krieger, was to recall to them the nature of their profession as historians. And he did this by reminding them that they had all read Thucydides, as many of you did, and that as students of Thucydides, they should know that wars rarely end the way they begin. Germany and Japan might well have been in the lead at that moment, but for Langer, the long game of the war was just beginning, and no one could predict with certainty what the final outcome would be. We didn't know whether we would win, but we also didn't know that we would lose. And Krieger's point in telling this story was his conviction that, as a direct observer, historians have the sense of the fragility and the uncertainty of leadership in times of radical crisis and change, but historical vision also gives the capacity for insight into the way in which political structures and deep cultural patterns, even beyond the quirks of human agency, can help to determine final historical outcomes. In a word, Krieger's story was about the advantages of historians as observers of and analysts of current history being made. But my question tonight is a little different one, and that is, what about the predicament of historians who are called upon to make history, or to put it in a very significantly less grandiose way, to at least be part of, in a participatory sense as administrative leaders, the shaping of their institutions, which is the situation I found myself in the beginning of the 1990s. I came to appreciate Krieger's story in the late 1990s when I found myself confronting a series of controversies about the future of the college and, in a broader sense, the future of the university. As a way to think through many of the challenges that I faced as dean, I began to undertake a series of monographic research projects, and these were short book or booklets that were on various topics on the history of the university. I began to write these books in the late 1990s during the administration of then-President Hugo Sonnenschein, when the initiatives of the administration at the time ran up against very significant opposition, great controversy on the part of faculty, alumni, probably still alumni in the room today, and your younger versions of yourselves, and students at the time. Sonnenschein's proposals, it wasn't simply his proposals, but there were proposals of people at the time, were deeply controversial, and they led to sizable protests and soul-searching. These protests were based upon forcefully articulated and sincerely felt conceptions of what the university should stand for, what it should be and not be. And many of these these articulations invoked a noble, what I would call an imagined noble past of the university that seemed to justify what the critics saw to be a pleasing and highly defensible status quo. The changes, you will remember, those of you who were involved in observing them at the time, this was about 15 years ago, involved fundamental reimagining of the university's demography and its budgetary structure, centering on the role of the undergraduate college and the wider university. And although the changes put in play might have been clothed in soothing past messages of, well, these are only minor adjustments. In fact, they were not minor adjustments. They were quite radical. And in a sense, they required a very different way of doing business and different ways of imagining the university's future. I'll be talking about some of them specifically later in my comments. So the acceleration of change at the time was accompanied both by conflicting memories, and for some, no memories at all, as to the deeper past that defined and constituted the work of the university. And as a professional historian, I found myself fascinated by the ways in which tidbits of our history could be used and deployed in shaping conversations for or against this or that thing that was happening or was about to happen. And out of vexation, but also curiosity, I decided to kind of go into the archives. As Robin mentioned, I was trained, and I am a historian of the Habsburg Empire. I'd be honored and delighted to come back and give you a lecture on the Habsburg Empire. Not tonight. I decided that someone should go into the archives and try to find out actually what had happened in a kind of Ronchian sense, what had really happened, in order to recreate, as Christian Meyer, a distinguished German historian, once put it, a kind of eye contact with our past, in hopes that my readers could better understand the complexity of our origins and development. This was not simply a theoretical exercise on my part, because people were coming to me, faculty, alumni, many people in this room perhaps, urging me to support or to oppose, to advance or to retard many of the changes that were afoot, and also to explain what was going on, and legitimately to say, okay, people are saying this, what do you think? You're responsible for this institution called the college, what do you think? And so this it led to, over time, a series of monographs. I wrote 17 of them between 1996 and 2013, varying in size from 20,000 words to 60,000 words. 60,000 word version were very excellent through doorstops. So the larger book will probably be a better doorstop. The larger book was in part drawn from these monographs. There are, for those of you who have read the monographs and wondering why you should buy my book, there's a lot of new stuff too. So please buy the book. And they reflected the challenges that I encountered in the radical transformation of the college. And what would these involve? Well, they involved radically increasing the size of the college. When I started as a dean, we had about 3,200 students. We now have almost 6,000 students in the college. Restructuring our admissions process, our retention strategies, going from an admissions rate. The year I started as dean, we had been at about 70% of the students who applied. This past year, it was about 8.5–9%. Increasing or enhancing the academic quality of the students we admitted. We always had terrific students. I don't say that just to flatter all of you in the room. It's a true story, but we wanted even more qualified kids to learn about us, and we wanted more people in general to learn about the university. And we wanted to undertake major reforms in the curriculum and housing and career support services, faculty appointment resources, international education, many of the things you heard about in the video, and other policy domains. And so these were changes, and change comes oftentimes rather difficult to a complex institution that's so embedded in its kind of an imaginary past. So this was an attempt to sort out all of these things, and so I come this evening to kind of report on what did I learn, and perhaps more importantly, did it make any difference? I want to give you 4 examples of things that I did some research on. I want to focus especially on the fourth one, since it involves philanthropy, not as a current project, but as an historical tradition. So let me begin with the first three examples. The first, one of my first monographs involved the history of our core curriculum, a venerable and very distinguished part of our educational practice and our history, a curriculum that has helped define, I would argue, define the very identity of the university, and not just of the college, but of the wider university. The core dates, as you will know from, you will learn by reading from my book, from the early 1930s, and over time it became really an iconic symbol of the values and the aspirations of the university. Its academic intensity, its commitment to really a very aggressive and almost irreverent form of interdisciplinarity. It's highly combative, and I would say even at times somewhat brutal forms of discursive engagement, teaching people not to be satisfied with received wisdom, with their own answers and certainly other people's answers, and a constant asking of evidence, and evidence that was sometimes even annoying, like, enough of this evidence. How much evidence do I have to have? A lot. And yet the core that I encountered in the mid-1990s, in the midst of these other controversies, was I would argue, was frozen in time. It was suffering from a lack of investment by younger faculty who often did not understand its purposes, who understood those purposes as belonging to earlier generations of scholars and teachers whose intellectual priorities and cultural values and cultural priorities were not theirs. But that was the situation that I found myself encountering. And the context of this is, just very briefly, the core began in the 1930s as a program of study to introduce young scholars, young students in the first 2 years to the higher learning of the university. And it was a wonderful program, and it was very successful. But when Robert Hutchins became president in the 1940s, well, he became president in 1929, but Hutchins really didn't like the first core curriculum, and so he kind of broke it apart and reorganized it and made it into what came to be called an all general education curriculum, where students took nothing but core courses and ended up taking 14 comprehensive exams and getting a baccalaureate degree based upon general education. This is a very different conception of the core, and it was very popular with some faculty, and other faculty hated it. They hated it, and they hated Hutchins. And there were great debates about these two rival conceptions of general education. After Hutchins' departure, with the support of powerful graduate divisional interests, Chicago has the college, but it also has these graduate divisions, which are very powerful agents of graduate education. Hutchins' successor, Lawrence Kimpton, decided to launch what can only be described as a direct and really a resolute attack on the Hutchins College that stripped the college of the right to offer this all general education bachelor's degree, that forced the college to share its programs with the graduate divisions. And all of this resulted in a great deal of disarray. Those of you who were in the college in the 50s and 60s, I'm sure I hope you had a great experience, but in fact, from behind the scenes, there was a great deal of controversy. Many of the older, more senior scholars who were associated with the Hutchins College deeply resented what Kimpton had done. Many of the general education courses were, their feeling on the part of the sponsors that they were living on borrowed time. The dean at the time, Wayne Booth, who was a lovely man, unfortunately no longer with us, tried to kind of recreate and put Humpty Dumpty back together again and create a curriculum that would somehow broker the interests of the college and the graduate divisions with regard to the core. And he essentially created in 1966 what he called a hodgepodge that can be largely justified on political grounds. And Wayne, to the end of his life, and we talked about this a lot after he retired, felt really bad about his inability to kind of recreate a holistic, a satisfying, at least in his life, satisfying general education program, having to deal with all of these different pressures. Don Levine, when he became dean in the 1980s, tried again to create a uniform curriculum. And Don, who was actually also a very great dean, and unfortunately passed away this year, succeeded in doing so. But what Don did was to actually create an even larger core that existed in the 1960s by saying, we're not going to take anything away, we'll simply create a bigger core. And this is at a time when there were deep changes going on in American higher education more generally. Let me give you an example of three. First of all, in the 1970s and in the 1980s, faculty teaching loads at major research universities like Chicago and Harvard and Berkeley and Stanford began to shrink. This had to do with secular trends involving resource allocation and competition among faculty, and so that at the very time that Levine and the faculty in the 1980s are increasing the size of the core, the number of faculty hours spent teaching undergraduates actually declined. And this created real problems in terms of the availability of faculty to teach. It's not that faculty stopped teaching, but they wanted to teach, and this is the second issue, they wanted to teach courses that they could design, because most of the faculty we were recruiting in the 70s and 80s did not go to the University of Chicago College. In fact, because of the decline of general education programs nationwide beginning in the 1960s, most of them had not even attended a college that had general education, so they didn't know what this stuff was. I remember as a master, I once told this psychologist that we wanted him to teach Freud. He said, well, nobody believes Freud anymore. What? I said, well, you're going to teach him anyway. But he was an assistant professor, he didn't have tenure. And so you have changing intellectual patterns, you have a kind of reorientation of faculty effort, and you had a sense on the part of many younger faculty, well, these core courses are great, but other people design them, we want to design our own core courses. And so there were these tensions between more senior faculty and junior faculty, really having to do with status and intellectual taste. It wasn't the case that people did not believe in general education. They did, but it was kind of every person for himself wanting their kind of general education. And this resulted in, I would say, not only unfortunate tensions, in some ways it was a good thing, because all of these debates were going on, and so people were preoccupied with the core. They were fighting over it, which was a good thing, because it helped to protect the core in general. We still have it because of all of this animation. But by the 1990s, it seemed to me that we were kind of living beyond our we needed more legitimacy and more buy-in from a larger body of the faculty about where we were going to go forward. And so I started a process of reviewing the core. It became known as the Core Wars. There were articles in the New York Times, there were alumni websites denouncing what we were doing without even knowing what we were doing, which is fair enough, because we were working through it ourselves. But one of the things I discovered as part of my research is that there was no single core, and that there were these multiple cores. And there was the core in the 30s that Hutchins attacked, and then there was the Hutchins core that Kimpton attacked, and then there was the Booth core, and there was the Levine core, and there was this core and that core. There were commonalities and there were differences, so it was completely legitimate for the faculty to engage in a very serious discussion. A discussion that I tried to guide and tried to bring us back to the original conception of the core in the 1930s, which I thought was really a very sound conception. I have enormous admiration for Hutchins, and my chapter on Hutchins is I think generally fairly admiring, but I think his attack on the 30s core was a disaster for the history of the university. It was a complete disaster. And I thought that if we could go back to the original conception of Boucher and the others who created the core in the 30s, this would be a good thing. And so the monograph was an attempt to kind of open things up, to tell people, look, it's okay to disagree. We're not going to destroy the university by disagreeing. In fact, this is what the university should be about. And it worked. After 3 years of very arduous debate, the faculty voted a revised curriculum, which we still have today, and there's enormous buy-in. We have much higher rates of faculty participation in the core than we've ever had before. It's a signal element. The faculty is actually very proud of the curriculum, and I think this could not have happened without going through this kind of Sturm und Drang of debate, and by bringing the history alive and showing how conflicted it was, by telling the real story as opposed to some kind of marketing, telling stories to ourselves about how everything was all fine and good and everything, don't change anything. It was actually by confronting the reality of our own history that we were able to move beyond that history and create a new history for ourselves, of which I think we could all be very proud. A second example of this relationship between history and policy involved the arts. Now, I wrote a monograph several years ago on the history of the arts, and I did this really because I became interested in the what I would call this tension between theory and practice, and which is a very venerable Chicago problematic. The arts came to the university late. The music department and art history department were created later than most of the other departments. Harper wanted a music department and an art history department, but he was never able to create them. So they came after World War I. And the art history and music department, they struggled. They were kind of like the little puppies at the end of the litter, and they felt they didn't get enough resources. Departments always feel they didn't get enough resources, but in this case it was actually true. They didn't get enough resources. And because they were struggling, and because they were new and they were trying to create a kind of scholarly footprint for themselves, which is, especially a graduate department, that's their responsibility, they kind of left the undergraduates to themselves. And so what evolved over the course of the 20th century, and I think this is still much the case in Chicago today, is you have this kind of semi-independent arts culture in the student body, which is not beholden to, controlled by, dictated to, or even regulated by the faculty. It's out of that body, out of that culture comes the Compass Players and the Second City and University Theater. And it's really a quite extraordinary story of a kind of a semi-independent student arts culture that grew up in the absence of a kind of hegemonic faculty arts culture. And after World War II, when you had more investments in the scholarship side of the arts, which was worthy and important, the student culture continued and thrived. And then many faculty, especially in the 1990s and 2000s, who were actually interested in the practice of the arts as well as in the theory of the arts, got together and lobbied the administration at the time. We needed more arts facilities, so that we were able to obtain a very lovely gift from David and Reva Logan to build this new Logan Arts Center, and that was cited in the video, and I hope you've all had a chance to visit it. And so around this time, so we're building the building, and we've got the student groups that are thriving, and the faculty groups are kind of mobilizing. And so I said to myself, well, maybe it would be good for someone to take a look at where we came from as a way of charting where we could go to, and is there a way that we could begin to stitch together, not in any way destroy or limit, but stitch together the arts culture of the students and the arts culture of the faculty, so we could have a kind of holistic culture. And so that was really what that monograph was about, and it really attempted to create what I call an entente cordiale, like adopt a diplomatic term, between the practice of the arts and the theory of the arts. And I have to say I'm rather proud of that monograph, because it was something that was already nascent. Younger faculty, we have a lot of younger faculty are arts makers as well as arts theorists. And the Logan Center itself is designed to create a kind of bricolage of the theory, studying the theory of the arts, but then immediately trying to translate that into practice. And so this was an attempt on the part of myself to open up historical issues of things that we had not done, paths we had not taken, paths that we'd wanted to take, and we're not able to take for resources, but then to kind of bring that story down to the present and to create more possibilities for the arts today. And I think today, those of you younger students in the room, younger alumni in the room, we have a thriving culture of the arts, and it's something we can be extremely proud of, not just because we've invested a lot in more adult professors, but also because we're investing a lot more in student arts, and yet the faculty are paying a great deal more attention to the student arts, and the teaching now is much more on a broader continuum of engaging student practice as well as scholarly theory. A third topic that an example of my interest in interrogating history was a bit more prosaic, but also deeply, perhaps more deeply problematic, and that had to do with housing and residential life. In 2007, I wrote a long monograph investigating the history of housing policy on campus, and the purpose of this little book was to try to frame wider debates about the options and choices made, and even more importantly, not made in the past, but also to set forth an argument that what I believe to be, and I was very candid about this, the faulty, and I would say even oftentimes non-existent planning practices of the university and the kind of helter-skelter helter-skelter ways in which undergraduates were housed, that this should change, that the university should begin to develop serious, make more serious investments in housing, but also to make more serious investments in what I would call the broader social and cultural environment of our student body more generally. So housing became not simply something in and of itself, but a kind of metaphor for larger issues that I thought the university needed to address regarding student life, both on the undergraduate and also on the graduate level. Now, the background to this, as I discovered, I knew nothing about the history of our housing system, was that unlike our Ivy peers, Chicago's record in building housing was fairly modest, some would say even benighted. Before World War I, we built a few residence halls. The majority of the residence halls built before World War I we still have. They're good buildings. It turns out that they mainly house graduate students, not undergraduates. Most of our undergraduates lived at home. They lived with their families. We were a kind of, as my colleague Barry Carl once called it, we were a streetcar college. You know, our students came by streetcar to the campus. This was, there were too many other needs on the horizon. Harper was a young president frenetically trying to build a great university overnight. He needed to do a lot of things, and housing got kept back. Well, we'll may get to that eventually, but not now. In the 1920s, we had a truly inspiring president, who I think was one of our greatest presidents, Ernest DeWitt Burton, very much influenced by Oxford and Cambridge and that model of residential life. And Burton actually developed a plan for a comprehensive residential community for the college. The whole South Campus plan that Burton developed was really quite remarkable. He wanted to have a set of residential colleges that would house 3,000 students on the South Campus, land that had been given to the university by the Rockefeller family. And he developed this plan in a very eloquent way. He went around giving speeches to alumni, as I am giving tonight, lobbying, kind of the bully pulpit, we need to do more. And his argument was not simply that we were doing this because people needed a place to sleep, but because for Burton, residentiality was a very simple form of liberal education, that we wanted people to be 24/7 engaged with ideas. We didn't want them to go to class and then get on a streetcar and go back to Uptown or Englewood or to Roseland. We wanted our students to be engaged 24/7 in the life of the mind, and for that you needed to have residential communities. It seems to me something that nowadays we would take that as kind of self-evident argument. It was a very new argument in the 1920s. And Burton articulated this, and unfortunately, he died prematurely. He was only in office for a couple of years. And although his successors tried to implement the plan, the one building they managed to build was, as you will not be surprised, was Burton Judson. There was supposed to be ultimately 8 Burton Judsons on that site, but they built one and the Depression came. But there was a lot of controversy over this, and one of the men who was associated with building Burton Judson, a guy named Frederick Woodward, who was the acting president at the time before Hutchins takes over, supported Bill, and there were senior faculty who just hated what Woodward was doing. There was a committee of senior faculty who were searching for a new president, and they basically said to Woodward, you go ahead and you build that building, your chances of succeeding to the presidency are over. I mean, and so that we ended up, Robert Hutchins was elected, suggested by these people as the kind of the anti-college president, and it just shows you that search committees sometimes get it wrong. The men who hired Hutchins were quite disconcerted when Hutchins showed up and said, no, actually we're going to invest in the undergraduate program. Not, but housing as a very prosaic thing became determinative, literally, of the future leadership of the university, in the sense that senior faculty they didn't want residential life because they didn't want undergraduates, and they wanted this image of a university as largely a PhD factory with lots of graduate students in it. And William Dodd, who was actually had another life as our American ambassador to Germany. He was as a European historian, I would say he was a so-so ambassador, not the best, not the worst. But he said he argued, these dorms attract lazy, indifferent students. That's not the Chicago way. Let these people go to Harvard or Yale. They like people like that. And then after World War II, we finally got around to building a couple of halls. Those of you who lived in some of these places, They were called Pearson Woodward. They were called, and I'm already historicizing them. And they were designed, well, let's say with modest accoutrement. They had small, undersized rooms. They were seriously overcrowded. The college housing staff struggled to maintain expectations. And you find this fascinating correspondence of the housing staff really arguing that, even with these new dorms, what the university then did was to take many of the older dorms offline. So there was this group of dorms called Kelly, Beecher, Green, Foster. It was called the C group. And when they opened Woodward and Pierce, they decommissioned those and turned them into office buildings. And so rather than our ability to house more students, we actually went backward and could house fewer students. And the Warner Wick, who was the dean of students at the time, writes to a colleague saying that we are in trouble, chiefly because of decisions made long ago, but also because of decisions made right away. He had to be a little bit respectful because he didn't want to attack his bosses. He says, talk of our residential college is a big laugh. Okay? They were telling prospective students, you're going to come to a residential college. The dean of students is saying this is a big laugh. The world is hearing about it. The residential college, quote unquote, that we spoke so proudly about 5 years ago has become a bitter joke. And this is by the senior administrator at the university responsible for housing. And then, of course, what happened was the university struggled further. They began to acquire properties off campus, the Shoreline and Broadview, which were attractive properties at one point, but which were not in good shape. This was called the neighborhood strategy, and we ended up busing students around the neighborhood. Many of you may have ridden buses from Shoreline back and forth. I hated those buses. They don't exist anymore, and I still hate them. And this is not the kind of residential community that Burton and that Harper and that even subsequent leaders, even Edward Levy, wanted. And so it was not until the late 1990s the university finally embarked on the construction of new residential communities. Pulaski, Granville, Grossman were now building another big building in South Campus, and we're having to build that because of Pierce. Pierce had a problem. I was very lucky in 2011 and 2012, all of the plumbing backed up. And since we're in a polite society today, and there's been food consumed, I'm not going to go into details. I will say that when gravity is reversed with toilets, problems. I was later accused of having taken a wrench and gone over to Pierce and having caused the problem. I want to say publicly, I officially deny that I did that. But anyway, the fact that I had written this monograph laying out all of these issues was actually helpful. The students actually had read the monograph. I had kids who were calling the newspapers and calling television stations, citing Dean Boyer's monograph about Ernest Burton. It was a University of Chicago moment. It was great. And so history did play a role, and I think we would have done the right thing anyway, but in this case, to look into our past was very helpful, and that seems to me very important. And the final example of my history work that I want to discuss is the subject which in part we come today to talk about, and that is philanthropy. In 2004, I did a monograph on the history of philanthropy, and I did that for two reasons. First of all, I was concerned, to be very candid, that at our university and many other research universities, the priorities of fundraising, setting fundraising priorities often left teaching and student life kind of at the bottom of the list, and I was frustrated about that. Secondly, there was also a sense coming out of the controversies of the late 1990s, the colleagues in development at the time, none of the colleagues today in development, but people back then, were saying, the alumni are angry, we better not talk about the college. Let's just kind of, we'll talk about the university in general and so forth. And I said, no, I don't think that's right. I think we ought to be honest with the alumni. We ought to go out and, if they're concerned, let's talk to them, try to persuade them about what we're doing, or maybe if we're wrong, we can persuade them not to do what we're doing. Let's get out and talk. And so that the monograph about philanthropy was an attempt to try to engage at a specific moment many of the issues that we were facing by not talking about what we were doing in the context of a campaign. A campaign had been started in 2000 and ended in 2007. Now, it turns out, what did I learn? Well, I learned a number of fascinating things. Philanthropy was at the source, first of all, of the failure of the first university, the lack of philanthropy. There was a first University of Chicago that went bankrupt because they were unable to raise money for themselves. They brought great shame upon themselves, and they felt very bad about it. And so they asked the Lord, they asked divine providence for a second chance, and this second chance came in the presence or in the gifts of this very wealthy Baptist from New York City, John D. Rockefeller. And so our university started with enormous philanthropy, and we became a very wealthy university, very wealthy, unusually wealthy university overnight. And the Rockefellers themselves and their charities and boards, the foundation, the General Education Board, and so forth, played an enormous role in launching the university. If you look at the gifts that we received from outside donors between 1890 and about 1930, over 60% of all the gifts came from the Rockefellers or the charities. It's really kind of an astonishing record. And it was quite extraordinary. And the level of support that we received was so generous. And the Rockefellers were very abstemious. They didn't meddle. They didn't try to put ideological strings on what we were doing. So that the kind of faculty culture that we evolved, this very independent faculty culture that could assimilate and articulate and defend the idea of academic freedom, that felt itself to be worthy of being free. And if the faculty were free, then the students could be free. It seems to me that there is a very strong connection between that and the kind of resources we had at the very beginning, that we were not dependent upon asking money from people who would try to curb our virtue and our freedom. And that was exactly the arrangement we had. And so it's actually quite an extraordinary story. Great universities launched within 20 years. Chicago was one of the top 3 research universities in the United States that didn't exist in 1890, and we were very wealthy. Well, that's the good side of the story. But what I also learned is that this reliance on the Rockefellers, and then after World War II, reliance on the Ford Foundation, in a sense it had unhappy consequences, because what it did do was it led the university to neglect its alumni. And I told this story in a fairly unvarnished way in my monograph, and it also led us to neglect, what I would argue, are the kind of civic elites of Chicago. The money is in New York. Why worry about Chicago? It's not that we weren't raising money for Chicago people, but there was a sense on the part of the university, well, that, you know, we'll kind of try to explain what we're doing, but, you know, we don't really need these elites because we have other resources. And then Hutchins, who was an extraordinary person, an extraordinarily courageous figure, defending academic freedom. Many of the people in Chicago who had money didn't like academic freedom. Many of them voted for the other guy in 1932, not for Roosevelt. There were millions of Americans who did vote for Hoover, remember? And Hutchins was a New Deal Democrat, a kind of closet New Deal Democrat. And so you have all of these problems coming up, having to do with our fundraising success on the one hand and our fundraising success with our own people on the other. And this led me to tell the story in 2004. I remember Don Stewart, who was a wonderful guy. He was the president of the college board, someone sent me this monograph to him, and he very skillful guy, I think he'd been former president of Spelman, experienced fundraiser, and he walked into my office and he said, you know, he's holding this book and he said, this is the most depressing book I've ever read. I said, you're kidding. He said, no, really, it's depressing. How did you guys survive? I said, well, that's a good story. Kind of with a wing and a prayer. And but the important thing was that for me to tell this story and to try to communicate it, really, we needed to do much more in communicating with our alumni. We needed to do much more in terms of explaining not only what we were doing, but what we wanted to do to support our students. And I think that the success of the campaign that ended in 2007, you know, we ended it with the Odyssey gift, and I think that's very important. The Odyssey gift was a gift for students. It was a gift for scholarship support, the second largest gift in the history of the university. And then the current campaign, which you saw this video about relating to, many of the objectives that we're raising money for are raising money for student support. Student support in the broadest sense, teaching and student life. And I think that it's this incursion into history gave me a sense of not only the possibilities that we needed to attend to, but also of our failures and things that we should remedy. And in that sense, that it was a very important moment for me, and much of that has found much of that information and data has found itself into the big book I just published. I want to say finally some concluding remarks. about the, drawing from these 4 episodes, the curriculum, the history of the curriculum, the history of the arts, the history of housing, and the history of philanthropy. In his memoir on the English universities, Noel Annan, it's called The Dons, Memoir, Mentors, Eccentrics, and Geniuses. It's a wonderful book, and I recommend it to Noel Annan, A-N-N. He writes about the administrative leadership of the humanists who served as vice-chancellors of Oxford University, and the office of vice-chancellor is the top office at Oxford in terms of management. And he writes about these, this was a closed world. These men, they were largely men at the time, all knew each other. They could throw parties, they could connive, they could gossip, but they could pour each other more sherry than they could probably reasonably consume, and so forth and so on. And so it was kind of a world of charming tactics and brute force and high and clever rhetoric, but it was a world in which it was a stable and sedentary world in which everybody knew everybody else, and you came to Oxford and you stayed there for decades and so forth and so on. But our situation in these great American universities is a little different. In the present day, we're organized with large administrative bureaucracies. We're filled with faculty who come in and out, oftentimes as often as the students, or at least we're much larger than we used to be. Strangers gazing upon strangers. And this is not just Chicago. I'm talking about all of the great research universities, where the possibility that the faculty can turn over as rapidly as the students. It creates problems and challenges for governance and for community feeling, where we have rival and often divergent patterns of collective self-interest among various segments of the faculty. It seems to me that, and where we face a broader policy environment in which I'm sad to say that many folks really, I fear, don't really understand what the fundamental purposes of what a university is and what it should be, and more importantly, as Hutchins always said, what it should not be. It's what it should not be, what it should not try to do. It seems to me in these kinds of environments, worrying about our history, inquiries into our history can play more than simply a decorative role. At least I have found that telling the story of our university can do more harm than good. Writing history alone is no substitute for making it, but combining the two can afford the historian and administrator some valuable perspectives to act as well as to tell and to smash some cherished myths along the way. Universities are exceedingly complex institutions. Their complexity is not timeless and one-dimensional. They're grounded in myriad decisions and outcomes taken by their leaders over time. They face a host of challenges today. The American universities are among the most prestigious institutions of our society, but they're buffeted today by serious financial pressures and cultural pressures. They face issues of conformity. Their federal regulatory regime, that's not a Democratic or a Republican statement, it's the federal regulatory regime, worries faculty about what the environment of free speech on campus. The whole issue of trigger warnings, you probably saw that recent article in the, I believe in the Atlantic Monthly or Harper's about trigger warnings. It seems to me reveals a lack of understanding of what a real university is on the part of many young people and some faculty, I'm sad to say, who seek to use the curriculum of the university as a kind of buffer zone against unpleasant or controversial issues. Universities are being bashed by critics who complain that their faculties have lost sight about fundamental educational mission and are producing a generation of sheep-like students who cannot think for themselves and have lost their moral compass. Many faculty in the humanities are worried about enrollments, about the so-called decline or collapse of the humanities. They in turn are being forced to explain the relevance of the humanities, which they feel to be inactive. They feel kind of ashamed to have to do that. What great university would force its humanists to explain their relevance? And yet, this is the situation we find ourselves in. Public universities in America are caught up in a slow but drastic decline of public funding, which then often results in politically unpopular, perhaps even toxic increases in state tuition levels. Doctoral programs in many disciplines in both public and private universities are under great pressure with the collapse of the academic job market. We know we're producing far more PhDs than can ever possibly get academic jobs. Many of them want academic jobs, and so what to do about it? This is an extremely controversial topic, and many courageous graduate deans are trying to reduce enrollments and deal with time to degree, and this is causes stresses in the governance. Again, there you go again, changing things. Well, the normal degree to a PhD ought to be 9 years. It has to be 9 years. To make it 8 years would be the Western civilization would collapse or something like that. In all of these controversies, it seems to me it's helpful to step back and to ask about the fundamental purposes of the university and its history, and coming to articulate these purposes. And the topics that I just mentioned are not, they're often thorny, they're often bereft of easy answers. Some are false prophecies and hostile ships passing deliberately in the night. I think it's important that young academics entering the Guild, and I think it's important that alumni who are loyal members of and supporters of these great beasts of intellectual prey that we call the research universities, that they learn something about how universities operate, that they learn something about how they're financed, they learn something about how they do their business or don't want to do their business with the government. They learn something about the tough and painful choices that their administrative leaders must make to protect the fundamental values of these institutions. They should learn something about the many public and private constituencies with whom universities are compelled to cooperate. They should learn something about what you think, about what they think. It seems to me that in all of these cases, we would all profit from a more acute sense of how our institutions have come to be what they claim to be, and the messy and often inchoate ways in which they have fashioned their collective codes of identity and cultural practice. And we would also learn, do well to understand and to be able to talk about the broader mission of these institutions, anchored in their histories beyond the constraints and self-indulgences of our own fields or our own little garden. The very best American universities provide exemplary service to our nation, and I mean service in the most noble sense of the word. That word, they provide rich and stimulating environments for us to educate the young in the skills of scholarly dispassion, intellectual precision, and an enhanced intellectual taste, and they are at the forefront of generating new knowledge to enrich our collective futures. They are the custodians of a vast array of historic, intellectual, and aesthetic achievements of mankind in the new and distant past. Our libraries and archives are unparalleled as repositories of the remarkable creativity of our many great civilizations. And they provide sites of intellectual freedom where our members, our students, our faculty, and our alumni may investigate and speak freely, all the while admonishing each other that their assertions glibly made are not the same as assertions proved with solid and reliable evidence and cogency of argument beyond whatever ideology you like on that given day. They are communities of extraordinary talent, and on balance, they do great good for our students, our faculty, and our communities. In explaining all facets of our identity, a historical perspective, and a grasp of the institution's history itself can prove, it seems to me, exceedingly useful, and not just for the local historians. The study of history can help us clarify the range of options and opinions available in difficult moments. By testing institutional myths and patterns of decision-making, we may have a more realistic sense of what we can do, not only in the present, but what we should do in the future. And leaders of higher education certainly need guidance in the future. And perhaps most importantly, studying institutional history is ultimately a way of taking responsibility for the whole of our university. We all come from different parts. We all have different identities. But this is a whole thing. This was Harper's idea. This was Levy's idea. This is a whole university. It was created all at once. It has to be protected all at once. It has to be understood all at once. And it seems to me that special sense of wholeness is particularly is best understood and certainly best defended by knowing something about our history. And dealing with phenomena like trigger warnings and economic freedom and student services and fundraising and housing, and et cetera, et cetera. These are all issues that impinge upon the fundamental values of any institution. And to protect those values, we have to understand where they came from. In our case, it's a tribute to the University of Chicago that it has manifested such a richly textured, and I have to say, such a wonderfully internally contested history. This is not an easy place to govern. It's not an easy place be, but it's a richly contested place to be. Chicago is a place that cares profoundly about the substance and the meaning of the higher learning and the many struggles which it has engaged in over the decades to sort out how and when and why to give voice to its beliefs about the higher learning constitute, for me, a fascinating history and an episode in the history of American higher education. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'd be happy to take some. I may be standing between you and something else, but I'd be happy to take a question.
We have time for one quick question.
It's not a very Chicago way, but anyway, yes, please.
Would you discuss the difference between your book and Richard Storr's of several decades ago?
Yeah, Richard Storr was a wonderful fellow who's, he began he set out to write a multi-volume history of the university with the support of Harold Swift. Harold Swift basically bankrolled the book. Storr's worked for years on this book, and Swift became very impatient and would ask him, like, is it finished yet? Is it finished yet? And Storr's did an enormous service to our community by writing the story of Harper's University. He also did an enormous service to yours truly by leaving the archive of all of his interviews, because in interviewing people about Harper, he found that many people didn't know anything about Harper, but they knew a great deal about Hutchins. And so in the Storr's papers, there are very rich transcripts and interviews of people who knew Hutchins that I found absolutely invaluable. Storr's left the university to take an appointment at another Canadian university after he published the book. He never did a volume 2 or volume 3, so it was kind of a torso. But it's a great book, and it's one that I profited greatly. My interpretation of the Harper era is somewhat different than his, but you could read it too and then see what you think. So. Are we over? One more question? We're over, okay. So again, I want to thank all of you for your attention, and to have had the honor to serve as the dean of this institute, of the college, these many years has been a great honor, but it's been an even greater honor to have the privilege of going in and sorting out the history. It's a history in which we can all be extraordinarily proud. Because it wasn't all good, it wasn't all successful, it wasn't all perfect, but in the end, it resulted in a magnificent university, and I think from that we should be terrifically proud.
Thank you, Dean Boyer, for your wonderful remarks. Clearly, I've just spent too much time listening to you. I was just really excited to get to share the stage with you for once. My name is Nigas Debebi. I am a graduate of the college from class of 2009. And also the Vice President of the DC Alumni Club here. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Damon mentioned the 125,000 engagement goal, and just by being here, all of you have helped us make a little bit of progress towards that. I also just want to thank you, because as members of the DC Alumni Club, you make us one of the most active alumni clubs in the nation, which for a community that has a shared experience of where fun comes to die, being part of a club that organizes more than 100 events a year is pretty impressive. Next month, we're taking part in the university's Career Month by organizing a career panel on careers in government, featuring a number of distinguished alumni who have worked in career campaigns and elections, as contractors, and in the civil service. You can find out more about that event on our website, and you can also sign up for our bi-monthly newsletters to keep aware of all of our other events at UChicagoDC.org. If you were particularly inspired by that video, which I noticed didn't include any views of the A-level of the reg, perhaps for a reason, you can also attend our programming meeting on Monday and learn how you might organize an event yourself. And again, make a contribution towards this 125,000 engagement goal. If you'd like to know any more about the Harper Lectures, any of our other events, or how to get involved with the Alumni Club here in DC at all, I'm around. You can find any of us at the other board members or other representatives from the Alumni Association at the alumni table and mingling around at the reception. So please feel free to approach us, just say hi, and ask us any questions if you're curious. And now I believe I am supposed to draw a name from for the raffle for a signed special edition of Dean Boyer's book. Do my best to be impartial. I have not put a card in there, just to be clear. Sander Davidson. All right. All right, and I'm told if you were not the winner of tonight's drawing, there are a limited number of signed copies available outside at the table for $35. You can see Mari, who was my lovely assistant, if you're interested in purchasing one. Thank you again for bringing your curiosity, and if you're interested, the reception will be continuing just now. Thank you.